You can think of design as pertaining to space, and our ideas of space, what it should look like, are really conditioned by our upbringing and popular opinion of what people think looks good. I saw this commercial landscape, and it gave me a sense of satisfaction. However, this landscape is groomed, static, and not nature-friendly, and I don't garden that way. So I need to think about why I felt that way. Here's an example of a suburban landscape. The house as centerpiece, with a large lawn stretching to the curb, a couple of isolated trees, and foundation plantings. The owner strives to offer curb appeal to passers-by. On the other hand, the backyard is typically private, set up for family and friends to enjoy. You may have noticed that in these landscapes that nothing is amiss, not a leaf out of place, and everything well groomed. But is this really how nature is? Nature is messy. We have fallen leaves, we have fallen limbs, springtime pollen, mowing grass, pruning back overgrowth. So there's a lot of effort to put in to making our yards look untouched by nature. Let's look at some of the changes and choices we made after buying our house in 1989. The backyard had a detached dance platform whose foundations we reused in our first project. This was a deck to replace the small concrete patio. The deck was an extension of our living space in the house and encouraged us to get outside more easily. The transplanted azaleas are now more than 5 feet high, and the small yew bushes more than 12 feet tall in the back corner. I had wanted a flower garden, and a section towards the rear of the backyard was chosen. My husband wanted a pond for koi, and so we incorporated a small pond into the midst of the garden. And it was all lovely, the colorful flowers surrounding this water feature, complete with fish, lily pads, and frogs. But the rudimentary filtration system was not enough to keep the water quality pristine for the growing koi. So we decided to expand the pond and upgrade the filtration. We built the third iteration of the koi pond in 2005, expanding it so we could see the sky reflected in the water from the deck. Koi disturb potted water plants, so we dug a separate pond to be a water garden for plants and goldfish. The pond was at a high point, which necessitated building retaining walls around it to settle it into the site, and steps up to a small bluestone patio for viewing the fish. We really enjoy feeding our pets and observing their personalities. Over the years, I have deposited leaves under rhododendrons along the back property line. On a woodland walk in the New York Botanical Garden with the former groundskeeper, Mike Ruggiero, I learned that the rhododendrons in remote locations where the leaves were allowed to accumulate were in much better condition than those in cultivated settings. One of the outcomes from this practice of letting nature do its thing was to get sports from the branches of the rhododendrons which touched the ground and rooted in the leaf litter. Planting these sports around the property enhanced the unity of the garden. My interest in gardening stemmed from my parents' involvement in gardens in the Midwest and the Berkshires. When my career in software engineering at AT&T was threatened by layoffs, I began the certificate program in landscape design at the New York Botanical Garden. I figured that I ought to learn more than what my own experience had taught me if I were to help others with their properties. At that time, native plants were not much on the radar of the New York Botanical Garden, which collected specimens from all over the world. It was not until several years after I graduated that they dedicated a section of the garden to natives. But a presentation given in 2006, after my graduation, by entomologist Doug Tallamy completely amazed me. He himself had been ignorant of the importance of native plants in supporting the insect community, a basic part of the food web, until he observed when clearing his own property of overgrowth that non-native plants had no feeding damage, whereas native plants had holes in their leaves. A pretty important discovery for someone specializing in insects. It had been 17 years of homeownership when this awareness of natives and environmental issues happened. In designing gardens for clients, I chose to use natives wherever possible and to care for the environment in my own yard. Along the way, I wanted to decrease the size of the lawn, to cut down on the mowing time and having to water it. One of the problems was having to make turns along the scalloped ins and outs of the Goldfish Pond retaining wall. I rebuilt the wall into a concave shape to follow the lines of a new, simple arc several feet away that now defines the edge of the lawn. The eye reads the void, in the words of English landscape designer Robin Williams. There is less clutter in this simpler configuration. The silver maples in the side yard had knobby roots that protruded into the lawn. I asked myself, why was I constantly scalping those roots by mowing? Why not just give back the land to the trees and let there be a setting where the leaves could settle? I created gracious wide curves for the beds to protect the roots, make a place for shrubs, and compost from leaves. Having such beds allows space for understory plants such as ferns and other shade-tolerant perennials, not to mention spring ephemerals. Where else could you have a sweep of Virginia bluebells interspersed with yellow wood poppies? These spaces can support understory trees as well. From whips or seeds now grow eager trees such as redbud, amelanchier, dogwood, holly, and juniper. Several oaks that have asserted themselves from acorns in flower beds are now on their ways to transform the patterns of sun and shade, and those plants that like it will flourish, while others will decline. It is a treat to pass through the garden along pathways that lead to something. I like the feeling of walking through a narrow corridor, opening out into an open space. Grass at one's feet and only a tall trunk with leaves high above don't provide the intimacy that can happen when vertical layers are cultivated. Plants are opportunistic, and when they find a spot they like, they flourish. My garden is full of ferns and heuchera that fill in the understory. A blue lobelia that disappeared years ago popped up this summer on the other side of the yard. A cultivar of rudbeckia and a blue-leaved hosta appeared away from their companions, and many Joe Pye stalks and cardinal flowers sprout up here and there. Pebble paths are nurseries to seedlings of all kinds. Initially, the utility path to the pond filter house was wide. There was a sedge that is named for pathways, which I used to weed out. Now it's filling in with soft blades about 6 inches high, hardy enough to take the occasional foot traffic. It is, after all, a utility path. There was a very large blue spruce at the corner of the house out front. Sandy toppled it. This was an opportunity for new plantings. The new native plantings were chosen to provide screening, autumn color, and berries. An oak replaced the splayed gray birch and would eventually shade the street and nourish many types of insects. Wildlife visiting our neighborhood may threaten our gardens. We fear the great blue heron, who would decimate our goldfish. So we built a heron foil. A fence keeps out deer in our backyard, but over the years the deer have now munched on the front yard plants. The Viburnum dentatum has acquired a vase shape, but still produces berries above the reach of the deer. Our ideas of a flower garden are influenced by English style, for example, Gertrude Jekyll, where the grouping of plants created floral patterns of color. When I started my perennial bed, I added Phlox David, a white cultivar resistant to mildew. Years later, I added some pink phlox. Now, I have self-seeded magenta blossoms popping up here and there, not in the mass I had wanted. So instead of the groupings of blossoms, I now have smatterings of color, all mixed in pointillist fashion. The various textures, hues of green, and seasonal changes provide interest. In moving the perennials closer to the deck, the garden has become more than just a clump of plants with colors, but a place where we could observe critters interact with and benefit from the garden. This activity gradually drew us in to discover ladybugs feasting on aphids, or spiders building webs, or small birds pecking out the seeds from grasses. My clients have told me that they have come to appreciate their new native plantings in the same way, never before having been attracted to what's going on outside. I used to collect the fuzzy white caterpillars that decimated the grove of gray dogwood every year. Then one summer, I realized that they only went after the dogwood and no other plants, which meant they must be a native insect which specializes in this dogwood. Now I leave the grove alone. The dogwood leafs out again in late summer. Cleopatra was a huge 10-year-old koi who recently laid copious quantities of eggs. She never recovered after that. She would sit on the bottom of the pond in various places, and eventually she died. During the time that Cleo was ailing, Katie, a 20-year-old koi, stopped eating and could be seen frequently swimming over to Cleo. After we removed Cleo from the pond, Katie kept visiting the places where Cleo had been. It was only after several water changes that Katie began to eat again. Please join me in a virtual stroll.